Welcome to this week's episode of the Cyberwork with Infosec podcast. Each week, I sit down with a different industry thought leader and we discuss the latest cybersecurity trends, how those trends are affecting the work of Infosec professionals, while offering tips for those trying to break in or move up the ladder in the cybersecurity industry. A few weeks back, we had Sam Busso on our show to talk about security concerns surrounding the escalated quantity of online shopping that people do around the end of year holiday gift giving season. And now it's time for that other hallowed holiday, the predictions for the new year. Today's guest, Evan Reiser, is the co-founder and CEO of Abnormal Security, an email security company that uses AI and machine learning to prevent socially engineered email-based cyber attacks. As with many other forms of cybercrime, email cyber attacks are only partly based in technology and have a lot more to do with social engineering and subtle use of the existing technology to get you to respond before you've had a chance to think about what you're being asked. We've seen some technology rise impressively in the past few years, becoming more effective at stopping malicious operations before they can get started. But that just means that the mental game is still the strongest game in town. So Evan and I are going to talk about some email attack trends that he's predicting will be on the rise in 2020 and beyond. Evan Reiser is CEO and co-founder of Abnormal Security, an expert in applied machine learning solutions with over a decade of operational experience building enterprise behavioral profiling technologies. Evan most recently led product management and machine learning teams for Twitter's advertising business, and prior to that co-founded several successful companies, including Bloomspot, acquired by JPM Chase, and AdStock, acquired by Telepart. Evan started his career at Eastman Kodak doing research and development in machine learning for intelligence applications. He holds a BS in computer systems engineering from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Evan, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
So close, and then beefed it down the last one there. So we always like to start out with origin stories. So tell us how you got involved in computers and tech originally, and when did security enter the mix?
Sure. So I got involved with kind of computers and technology long before security, actually. So like many people that grew up in the late 90s, the initial introduction to computers are through video games, and always trying to figure out how to make my computer more powerful so I could actually play games, and got into building computers in high school. I then decided to apply to colleges to do computer engineering. I thought computer engineering at the time was like building computers, like to do fun stuff.
Right.
I didn't realize it was like electrical engineering and math, but went to school for that. Got into computer science and building software, primarily to kind of fuel more kind of video game hobbies. And then ended up taking a job doing nothing related to anything I studied, no electrical engineering or math. It was actually just doing web development. Worked in, started off working on Wall Street. Quit that after about 18 months doing software, did a bunch of startups for like the next 10 years or so. And then really kind of recently got into cybersecurity by, just meeting some people in the industry and realizing what a big problem it was.
Okay. Was there something particularly that drew you to it, or was it more that just there was a niche that needed to be filled?
So I've worked, for the last 10 years, so I've worked in product management, and, part of the reason I've always been a builder of sorts. And I think the thing that kind of attracted me to working with enterprise businesses is getting to sit down with people, listen to their problems, and kind of bring them, these awesome solutions that they would get excited by. And so the thing that actually pulled me into cybersecurity and email security specifically was really just meeting a lot of customers. I'd met some investors that I worked with, and they introduced me to probably about maybe 20 or so Fortune 500 CIOs. And I sat down with them and I asked them, well, what is a product that you kind of wish the market would produce? Like, what would you like to buy in the next 6 months that costs, $250,000 or more? And very surprisingly, I thought they wanted, data infrastructure and, these other things. And just, this is at the end of, I guess, the beginning of 2018. And the number one thing they all said then was, we're having problems with social engineering, executive impersonation, fraud, account takeover.
Wow.
And that was like the main thing. And, I kind of didn't believe it. I ended up finding these stats from the FBI that kind of talked about what a big problem it was. And finally I realized that kind of my background and my team's background in machine learning was kind of going to be a great way to solve that problem. So I kind of got, sucked into it. And I was a little bit skeptical whether it was going to be the right thing for me, but I've actually really fallen in love with cybersecurity, and feel really fortunate to work in the space.
That's great. We touched on this briefly, but let's sort of dig into it. How did your early interests, jobs, experiences, studies, and other opportunities bring you from a burgeoning interest in tech into leading an email security company? Like, what are some of the sort of steps along the way where I learned this here and that helped, and I learned this there and that helped, things like that, whether it's education, whether it's previous jobs?
Yeah. I think, my kind of my early startup career, I worked in consumer startups, right? I think
Hmm.
the interesting thing about consumer startups is you kind of have this very fast development cycle where you're trying to build things, see if people like it, and then kind of, just iterate really quickly. And so it kind of helps you tune your just like, speed of development, capabilities, right? And just like reset your mindset of what it means to kind of build things. I then moved into enterprise software and, built, worked on several different products kind of that we sold to large enterprises. And I think the thing that I, learned from that and really enjoyed about that is you got to sit down with people, right? Instead of just publishing stuff on your website and kind of seeing, did the stats go up or down? You got to sit down with
Right.
someone and really understand, here's the problems they have, here's the environment they live in, here's their kind of hopes and dreams, what they wish people would do.
Hmm.
And I think just my experience, as a product manager, working with people and trying to, take technology that I knew about and kind of apply that to maybe new areas. I think just kind of that human back and forth and development and kind of really learning and empathizing, I think was the third thing. And then I think finally, just on the technology side, I'd spent a bunch of, most of my career in advertising technology. Advertising technology is really about, trying to understand the behavior of people and try to figure
Hmm.
out, how do you influence that or what causes things to be, them to be influenced. It's really, technology is all about, predicting behavior. And I think just kind of the intersection of this high speed development, this kind of customer focused, product development, and then kind of the, my background in, machine learning technology. Once kind of, I heard about these problems that, large enterprises are having with email security and social engineering. Just coincidentally, that experience, I think was really helpful in us, building ultimately kind of working with those customers and helping them solve these problems.
Well, that dovetails nicely into our main topic today, which of course is email attacks and how we think they might change in 2020 and beyond. So first, just to make sure we know what we're talking about, let's define our terms. When you say email attacks, are we just talking about phishing, or are there multiple variant attack vectors that we're speaking of with this term?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm a bit of a novice, right, in cybersecurity, and so I think
Okay.
one thing I was surprised by when we first started was just how many terms there were and how overlapping they are, right?
Right.
Sometimes people use phrases like business email compromise, and sometimes they mean phishing, sometimes they mean executive impersonation, sometimes they mean account takeover, right? And kind of they're
Right.
all blended together.
Yep.
And so there's a couple different frameworks people use to talk about different types of email attacks. I think they all there's a lot of kind of marketing folded in there. It's kind of hard to know what people mean.
Yeah.
One way that we use to think about is just talking about kind of the fundamentals of what is the attack. And there's kind of three categories that we use. So one is any sort of link-based attack, right? So traditional phishing, where they're trying to get you to go to some website, or it could be some maybe sophisticated advertising. Second category is some sort of file or attachment-based attack, where people are trying to use ransomware, malware to do a bunch of things.
Hmm.
The third category, which is where we really specialize in, is I think Gartner calls it payloadless attacks. The idea is that there's kind of no link and there's no attachment. So a lot of the kind of
Right.
conventional mechanisms for stopping it don't really work. So really that category, it's called payloadless because there is no traditional payload. I think those are generally, I would refer to those generally as like social engineering attacks.
Yep.
And kind of objectives vary. It could be stealing data. It's usually stealing money.
Yep.
But I would call them social engineering. They're not really payloadless, right? They are, the social engineering attacks, they have a payload. It's just like in the text, in the words, they're trying to
Right.
create
Right. It's
almost
still
like
driving you toward an action that results in a problem. Yeah.
exactly. And like the payload is almost like an emotional response where they're trying to get you to
Hmm.
think something and just like, you know,
Yeah.
bypass your traditional way of working. And they're very clever and they kind of change every day and every week. And so, but anyway, I think, any attack that's trying to, steal something from a company, it's coming in via email. I would generally put that into this bucket of, targeted email attacks.
So, what have been some of the major changes or shifts in tactics that you've seen in email attacks in 2018 and 2019?
Yeah, so I think when emails come a long way, but when people first started using email, the primary attack was just spam. Was people trying to, if you
Right.
realize you could just send ads to people and it would
Yeah.
people go click on stuff, they would make 1 cent per click or something like that. I think over the last 10 years we've seen the rise of kind of phishing and malware. Just as anti-spam solutions have gotten better, kind of attackers have gone to like the next most profitable thing. And I think the big trend, which it started many years, probably 4 or 5 years ago, but I think it really kind of blew up in 2018, was kind of the rise of business email compromise.
Okay.
And it's kind of it's kind of crazy, right? People realize that like the best way to make money from, harassing businesses is just to ask them to send you money, right? And it's, they're basically stealing money, but convincing people to do it through social engineering. And so I think that's kind of been the big shift is people have realized that rather than kind of spamming out, millions of emails and hoping that, one of a million work, they're spending time doing a bunch of research and really personalizing these email attacks, hoping that, 1 out of 10 work. But if it does work, right, it's going to be a, $100,000, win for them, right? They're going to steal a bunch of money from these companies.
Can you kind of walk me through like a scenario, like just a fictional version? Like what would like an example of like a customized email look like?
Yeah, so they really vary in kind of complexity, and maybe I could talk about a more complex one,
Sure.
later on. But kind of the canonical example would be it's almost kind of silly to talk about because it's surprising that these things work, but it is actually, I think, the number one cybercrime right now. People will go and impersonate an executive, so they might register a new email address, with kind of, let's say, Bill Gates at gmail.com,
Mm-hmm.
and then they'll send an email to the company using that executive's name. And they'll send it to the CFO, and they'll say, "Hey, I'm working on this project. I can't tell you about the details because it's part of this audit. I need you to send $1 million. I need you to pay this invoice for $1 million to this company. Can you help me with that today? Just because I need to finish this up." And people place so much trust in the identity they see in email that they fall for this. Not all the time, but maybe 1 in 100 attempts. And that's kind of the example. If someone tricks someone into doing something bad. There's 1,000 different flavors. People, they could be stealing, they could be asking for gift cards or invoice payments or, some credentials, but that's kind of maybe the most, common example.
Okay. Could you give us an example of a more complex, you said maybe later on, but could you give me a more complex example or I'm curious because I know that, that's sort of a common one is sending it to the payroll person and say, I need you to, do this for me or whatever.
Exactly,
and, or it's someone who's new to the job and, oh boy, the boss just told me to do something. I better do it, and stuff like that. But like, what are some of the more sort of like intrepid or unusual ones that you've seen that where you really just kind of shook your head with admiration a little bit?
Yeah, man, there's a lot. I mean, we probably see like a new attack every week, and like each one of these you get, they're kind of mind boggling. I have so many good examples to pull from. I'll go through with a relatively straightforward one though.
Okay.
They do get very nuanced. So we saw an example where someone was targeting a treasurer of a company, and they looked this person up on LinkedIn. They found some information on the LinkedIn profile. And they sent they created their own kind of Microsoft instance and created like a OneDrive file. And basically they kind of did this fake, almost like OneDrive sharing email. So it looked like it was coming from Microsoft. And it was basically from the person's boss. And it was like, Q4 budget plan or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so they got this email. It looked just like a, Microsoft OneDrive sharing link. The person clicked on it, which is a very targeted spear phishing email. The person clicked on it. They went to a fake Microsoft login page. They typed in their credentials. They went to a fake Microsoft two-factor page. So behind the scenes, the attacker then, the system triggered the two-factor alert. They got the SMS, they typed in their SMS, and then took them to a real OneDrive file. But the OneDrive file said, hey, deprecated, I'll send you the new file later, right? So kind of the user experience was like, oh, my boss just sent me this file, but it's out of date already, right? Okay, whatever. The attacker then, had the credentials, had the two-factor authentication code, logged into the treasurer's account, searched for the phrase wire transfer, found the last time this person had issued a wire transfer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Copied the exact same process, got a copy of this, Excel document, which was the process for doing a cash transfer inside this company. Then sent an email as a treasurer using the real email account, which obviously is authenticated, to the same person they always send it to, and said, hey, here's the new authorization form. Here's, my signature, because they had copied the signature out of the Excel file into the new Excel file. Yeah, I need this, payment sent to this bank in China. And this invoice had a very, kind of non-specific reason for why it had to be sent. And they end up sending, this money to China. And, they didn't find out for a long time because there's really no, signals in the email, right? And a lot of internal emails, they don't go through, secure email gateway. That's kind of, or sort of traditional defense. So that's kind of one example. And, there's actually even crazier ones, but that's at least one that's kind of probably a lot of people can relate to.
So sort of flipping in the other direction, can you think of like an unlikely tactic that works more than it realistically should, where like you can see it sort of empirically and say like no one's going to fall for this, but like people fall for it all the time. Like, because
Yeah.
you just gave me an example of one where it's like, I might well fall for that. That sounds all too plausible. But like, what are
Yeah.
ones where you're like, why are you still falling for this? It's so obvious, you know?
So there's also a lot to choose from here.
Mm-hmm.
One which I hear about all the time is basically these emails that they're trying to impersonate Microsoft, but it's like you've missed a voicemail, right? It's like
Oh, okay.
every business user should know, like you don't get voicemails through Microsoft, Office 365, right?
Yeah.
So that one's actually very common. We see those all the time.
Mm-hmm.
The other one I've seen that I was somewhat impressed by, but and somewhat surprised is an email campaign that had something like your car's been broken into, right? And then you had to like sign into some form to like get more information about it, and it had like a 20% open rate or something, but it was
Wow.
really, hopefully people have learned since that. But
Yeah.
it's crazy.
Wow. So, have you seen the awareness landscape change in the recent years? Is there any indication, on the other hand, that people on the whole are becoming more savvy around suspicious emails, or are we still kind of constantly reinventing the wheel year to year?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there has been a lot of improvements around, training and awareness and education.
Hmm.
Um, I do. I have kind of maybe a somewhat controversial opinion about this, but like I do
Okay.
feel like people have kind of given up on software for trying to stop a lot of these technologies. They
Mm-hmm.
said, there's no way you can stop these, programmatically or with software, right? Instead, let's go train our workforce to
Right.
go like recognize things. And it hasn't been unsuccessful, right? I think a lot of companies have gotten good results by kind of educating the company about it. They say, hey, like look for these things, and look at domains. If you don't recognize the sender, the email address, the link, just ignore it.
Right.
And I'm sure you've seen this, but almost, probably 80% of the Fortune 500, they have like these banners at the top of their email which says, this is from an external source. Do not, be very
Yes.
careful.
Right.
So I think in some ways, like, have those helped? Absolutely, right? I'm sure that the number of tax successes has gone down by half. But I do worry that the trend that we're moving towards is where we're using kind of like non-technology, right, to go stop the attack. And so, I think that there's, I think yes, that's been successful, but I don't think you really want to be training all your workers to spend 10 minutes of every day analyzing emails, right? It's probably not the kind of productivity that I'm sure a lot of CIOs are trying to get email productivity systems.
Sure. So, to that end, though, how does one change thinking that drives people to click suspicious links or give their information away? What are some security awareness things? What do you think that security awareness training should be focused on in these cases?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of it is focused on some of the mechanics, right? And some of these training programs. If you ask kind of the average employee, hey, what should you look for to identify a phishing email, right? They'll say, hey, look for people you don't know,
Yep.
look for like misspellings in the email,
Yep.
and look for like bad links or like weird links. And the challenge with that is like that's actually a pretty effective way of stopping the average phishing email.
Right.
But I think we're seeing this trend of personalization where people are they're sending these more and more sophisticated attacks where it's coming from someone you do know, and there are no
Yeah.
typos, right? Because it's been very thoughtfully put
Mm-hmm.
together. There's
Mm-hmm.
information that maybe sounds like only this person could know,
Yep.
and the links may not go to places that are very suspicious, right? It could be going to a Google Drive with a phishing link, right, or a
Right.
Microsoft file with a phishing link. And so I think that I think what I hope would happen and what I think may happen is people kind of shift the training awareness away from like the individual tactics to more on, hey, like if people are asking you to like bypass a business process and it sounds weird,
Yeah.
maybe just pause and take a second. And so I think the general education around like what's the psychology behind why these attacks work, the fact they bypass your critical thinking kind of judgment, parts of the
Right.
brain.
Right.
I think more of that would actually arm people. But that's probably not that's probably not the best solution at the end of the day because you still probably don't want to have every employee inside a company going through mental calculus for every single email they get.
Right. But at 30 seconds on the phone can probably solve a lot of these problems, right?
That's true. It's true.
Yeah. So, you've noted several times, it sounds like that spear phishing and whale hunting are probably more prevalent these days. It seems like they're becoming more targeted into higher levels. So considering the stakes, are there any indications that C-suite executives are receiving better security awareness training to combat that?
So I think so. I mean, certainly most companies that I talk to have rolled out some sort of training awareness program, and even people outside of cybersecurity are fair. If you look in finance teams and kind of the greater IT organizations, people are aware of kind of this email fraud, and I think especially at the more senior executives, they're very familiar. And I think maybe so I say like overall, yes, I think the industry is doing a good job of kind of educating people, and companies are doing a good job of kind of distributing that. I think that people are still a little bit unaware of just how sophisticated the real attacks get.
Hmm.
And my kind of explanation behind that is if you get a very sophisticated attack, right, and you maybe accidentally lose $100,000, something bad happens, you don't write a blog post about it, right? You don't talk about it.
Yeah.
You do call up the FBI, you ask them to help you get your money back, but
Right.
because it's embarrassing and it's something that no one really likes to talk about. I do think that there's a challenge in kind of helping people understand how sophisticated it is,
Right.
and so I think that's kind of a potential gap to maybe close.
Yeah. Removing the stigma a little bit.
Yeah, yeah,
So I saw a stat that the number of internet users will triple to over 3 billion in the coming years. And obviously a lot of those are going to be relative newcomers to technology and thus susceptible to attack. So what are some tips that you have for people who are just getting onto email for the first time, and how do we disseminate such email to newcomers? I mean, we're talking here about people who have probably been using email most of their adult lives. So like,
yeah.
how do we sort of quickly on-ramp people who are just getting on for the first time?
Yeah. I've been such a nerd, growing up, and for my whole life, I probably have lost perspective about what it's like to not use email or something like that. So
Yeah,
I,
exactly. Same.
I may not have great advice here, but I mean, I think the one thing that I think is like a general pattern that I think people should be aware of is I think kind of us as humans, right? We treat these digital communications very similar to how we do face to face conversation, and you really put a lot of trust in the identities of people. And I think people don't really realize um, that you can't always trust that when it says it's coming from Evan, it really is coming from Evan. And
Right.
so I think that if people just remove this mindset that like if it says Evan or if it says Evan's phone number, it's really that person on the other side of the keyboard, the
Yes.
other side of the screen. So I think just that if we could, if that was kind of the one thing that we told people, like, hey, just because it's coming from Evan's email address, right, doesn't mean it's really Evan on the other side of that email. I think if people kind of understood that concept more broadly, I think that would trigger probably the right type of critical thinking that would probably stop a lot of these attacks.
Okay. Do you have any specific recommendations for educating executive level users about email attacks?
Yeah, so I don't know if I don't know if I've seen kind of really great practices about that. I mean, I think one
Hmm.
is just, sharing information about, hey, here's what we've seen in the industry, here's what we've
Hmm.
seen in our peers, here's some of the things that were close calls. I think that the companies that, have kind of the intellectual honesty, I think culturally to really talk about those things, as an executive team, I think those people are more aware and more prepared. So that's just my observation.
Yep.
And then, if I could kind of, inject one piece of advice into, executive teams, generally, I would say that, you know, a lot of just these email attacks are evolving very quickly. A year ago, it was all about these business email compromises. Now we're seeing a huge increase in supply chain compromise, where people are saying, rather than going right to the company, it's actually better to go and take over a vendor account and then
Mm.
hijack a purchase order or invoice and get paid through that. And so the attacks are kind of moving outside of individual companies, right? And they're going into the supply chain. I think that will be probably like the next big problem that a lot of companies will face.
Okay. Any tips on that about using third party vendors and things like that? What should what should companies be changing in terms of their protocols for dealing with outside vendors?
Yeah, I mean, I think one is just realizing, it's kind of going back to the general advice is that just because it's coming from the vendor's email account doesn't mean it's really the vendor, right? We have seen a
Hmm.
lot of, vendor account compromises. And the other thing is just, generally sticking to, business processes and like removing the number of exceptions that, made, or the amount of people that are kind of bypassing that process. That is that is an effective way, right, to stop some of the attacks, and just being suspicious, right? If someone's changing their account number, routing number, right, things like that.
Yeah.
Probably it doesn't normally happen, and so it's probably good to verify.
Right. Okay. So, going beyond 2020 and sort of deeper into the future, where do you see email attacks going in 5 or 10 years from now? You think there'll be a point in which like AI or end user protection will make email attacks a lower order risk in the way that spam filters have turned that phenomenon into a little more than a minor nuisance?
So I do think so, actually. I'm sure 20 years ago, right, when people said, "Hey, how are we going to stop all the spam? It's like
Yeah.
seemingly impossible."
Right.
I'm sure it sounded like an unsurmountable problem. And if you look at, there's some companies that have deployed, great technology to go do that, right? Microsoft, Google, Proofpoint,
Yeah.
a bunch of others, and it's now become quite effective.
It's a weird exception when a piece of spam actually hits my inbox these days,
Yeah,
and it was
yeah,
not the case 20 years ago. Yeah.
totally. I mean, I remember like using, I guess spam, but I remember like even when I was in school, right in the early 2000, like you went to go look at your email, and it was basically like you had to hunt for the real
Yeah.
messages. Right now, it's kind of the way of doing things.
Right.
And I think that, and there was kind of this like mental overload that was required by people to kind of effectively use email. I
Hmm.
think it's now shifted to some of these, there's phishing attacks and
Yep.
these kind of social engineering attacks, and there's kind of more a similar space. And now it seems, almost crazy, almost unsurmountable. Could you build technology and software that could dynamically predict, a new attack every day? It's never been seen before. How is that even possible, right? Using kind of state of the art technology. And, the answer is right now, if you look at kind of what's been done for the last 5 years, like that's certainly not good enough. There's no way that that could go work. I do think that, 5 years from now, I think that, these solutions will improve, right? Of course, I'm biased here as a cybersecurity, email security
Yes.
vendor, right?
Sure.
I do think that these problems. I do think we can invent new technology across the industry that goes and stop this, and there will be something that's more advanced, right? When attackers find out this doesn't work, they move to something else.
Right.
But I do think that just given the power, just some of the more recent inventions in kind of deploying machine learning towards this, I think the reduction of cost and computational power, I think those things are going to make it really easy or much easier for us to go combat kind of the next generation of threats.
Hmm.
And my guess, they'll probably stick to be very similar. I think at the end of the day, it's very hard to break through cryptography or break through firewalls, but there are kind of these open channels of communication, whether it's email or phones or Slack or Skype or whatever it is. Those technologies are designed to like let people talk to each other. At the end of the day, I think attackers are going to be targeting, human judgment rather than kind of these technology systems. I think that's
Yep.
going to be the fastest way into these enterprises.
Okay. So as we wrap up today, let's talk about that. Let's tell me about abnormal security and some of the strategies and services that you provide to your clients.
Yeah, so I mean, at Abnormal Security, we're an email security company. We do
Mhm.
all things you'd hope an email security company to do. But where we focus is these social engineering attacks, right? Different types of business email compromise, executive impersonation. We also do the kind of these more sophisticated account takeover prevention, like similar to what I mentioned earlier. And the way we do it is a little bit different, right? Rather than purely relying on threat intelligence, where we're trying to recognize all the bad patterns, of behavior we've seen in the past, we basically use machine learning to go and understand. We connect to enterprises through APIs. We basically build a profile of like, what is this organization? Who are the people? Who do they talk to about what things? And we
Right.
use that to predict what is the normal behavior of business. And then when we see kind of things that look suspicious, right, they kind of deviate from this, normal pattern of behavior.
Right.
We use that as kind of the mechanism for stopping attacks. That becomes very effective for stopping, these different classes of social engineering attacks, right? Phishing emails never been seen before, emails without links and attachments, accounts that get compromised or sending internal emails that don't go through a secure gateway. So that's kind of where we focus, and we work with large enterprises to help them, stop the next generation of targeted email attacks.
Okay. If our listeners want to know more about abnormal security or Evan Reiser, where can they go online?
Yeah, so I mean, if they're curious about abnormal security, our website's actually really good. We show off, what our product does and what the technology does, and we try to be very transparent about, some of the things we're doing. So it actually has, it's kind of like a non-cybersecurity website where we'll show everything we do. So I'd recommend that. And then
what's the URL again? Abnormalsecurity.com?
Yep, abnormalsecurity.com.
Okay.
And if you're curious to hear my random musings, then you can follow me on Twitter, which is just Evan Reiser.
Okay. Reiser.
That's right.
Okay. Evan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Okay, and thank you all for listening and watching today. If you enjoyed today's video, you can find many more on our YouTube page. Just go to youtube.com and type in Cyberwork with Infosec to check out our collection of tutorials, interviews, and past webinars. If you'd rather have us in your ears during your workday, all of our videos are also available as audio podcasts. Just search Cyberwork with Infosec in your favorite podcast catcher of choice. To see the current promotional offers available to listeners of this podcast, go to infosecinstitute.com/podcast. And as we've been saying for a while now, you can download our free election security training resources to educate poll workers and volunteers on the cybersecurity threats they may face during this election season. For information on how to download your free training packet, visit infosecinstitute.com/IQ/election-security-training, or click the link in the description down there, I don't know where. Thanks once again to Evan Reiser, and thank you all for watching and listening. We'll speak to you next week.